Harvard law student faints mid-argument, then gets right back to work. Ethan Carter had always believed that greatness was forged in the fires of adversity. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio, he had been surrounded by people who worked tirelessly just to make ends meet. His father was a mechanic who spent 12 hours a day in a small garage, and his mother worked double shifts as a nurse assistant. From an early age, Ethan understood that if he wanted to change his life, education was not just a path, it was the only path. Harvard had always been a distant star in his universe. He remembered the day he received the acceptance letter, holding it in trembling hands, hardly believing that a kid like him, who had never even set foot on an airplane before, was about to walk the halls of one of the most prestigious universities in the world. The day he arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was both the proudest and most intimidating day of his life. The imposing brick buildings seemed to whisper the weight of centuries of excellence and expectation. From the very beginning, the experience was everything he had hoped for and everything he had feared. The classes were relentless, the professors were brilliant but merciless. Every discussion was a battlefield, every paper a war fought against both the clock and his own doubts. Most of his classmates came from families where law degrees were practically inherited, their parents judges, senators, or high-powered attorneys. They spoke in a language of confidence and entitlement that Ethan sometimes struggled to even understand. Yet, Ethan was no stranger to hard work. His days started before sunrise, with a run around the Charles River, trying to clear his mind and brace himself for the intellectual marathon ahead. Between classes, he worked part-time at the campus library and tutored undergraduates to afford rent and books. His evenings were consumed with case studies, research, and the kind of endless reading that seemed designed to crush the spirit of anyone who wasn't born for this. But slowly, cracks began to form. It started subtly, skipped meals to save time, less sleep to finish just one more brief, caffeine replacing rest. His body grew thinner, his eyes perpetually ringed with fatigue, but he ignored it. Failure was not an option. Not for him, not after how far he had come. The one event that loomed larger than any final exam or paper was the annual Harvard Law mock trial. It was the single most prestigious event for law students, a gladiator arena where reputations were made and futures decided. Every major law firm in Boston, and some from as far as New York and Washington, D.C., sent partners and recruiters to observe. Winning this competition meant not just bragging rights, but the kind of job offers that could set a career on fire. Ethan had prepared for months, sacrificing everything: sleep, social life, even basic self-care. His team had drawn a complicated case involving international maritime law, a subject notorious for its complexity. Ethan was responsible for the opening argument, the backbone of their case. If he faltered, the entire team would suffer. But as the date grew closer, the pressure mounted in ways he had never experienced. His heart raced at random moments. His hands trembled even when holding something as simple as a coffee cup. Friends began to notice his pale complexion, his distracted gaze, but he brushed off every concern. "Just stress," he would say with a forced smile. The night before the trial, he barely slept. His mind cycled through every possible argument, every potential counterpoint. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, he rehearsed lines silently, mouthing them into the darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, images of failure danced behind his eyelids. Forgetting. His lines freezing in front of the jury, letting his team down. The fear was suffocating, but so was the determination. Morning arrived far too quickly. Ethan dressed meticulously, choosing a crisp navy suit and a silver tie that his mother had sent him as a good luck charm. He barely touched the breakfast. He had forced himself to prepare. As he walked toward the law school's main auditorium, the weight in his chest grew heavier with every step. Standing at the grand oak doors, hearing the muffled conversations of participants, jurors, and spectators inside, Ethan took a deep breath. He reminded himself why he was here. He thought of his father's grease-stained hands, his mother's weary smile after a double shift, and the quiet sacrifices that had brought him to this very moment. But as the doors opened and he stepped into the spotlight, something unexpected stirred within him. A sudden wave of dizziness, as if the room tilted slightly. His vision blurred for a second, then cleared. His heartbeat, already fast, surged even more. He shook it off, attributing it to nerves. This was his shot, his moment. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop him now. Or so he thought. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Harvard Law School's Austin Hall, casting streaks of gold across the polished wooden floors. A quiet buzz filled the building as students, faculty, and observers gathered for the most anticipated event of the year, the annual Harvard Law Mock Trial Competition. For most students, it was a prestigious challenge. For Ethan Carter, it was the culmination of years of relentless effort, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of a dream that once seemed unreachable. As he walked through the crowded corridors, Ethan could feel the intensity in the air. Fellow competitors reviewed notes with laser focus, whispered strategies with teammates, and rehearsed their openings under their breath. Some wore expressions of confidence born from generations of legal lineage. Others, like Ethan, masked their nerves behind rigid professionalism. No matter their background, everyone in that building knew what was at stake. A strong performance here could lead to internship offers from the nation's most powerful law firms, or even direct mentorship from influential legal figures whose names carried weight far beyond the ivy-covered walls of Harvard. Ethan's footsteps echoed as he entered the preparation room assigned to his team. His teammates were already there, seated around, a large table cluttered with legal briefs, case notes, and annotated statutes. Marissa, the team's strategist, gave him a sharp nod, her eyes scanning her laptop screen as she cross-referenced precedents. James, responsible for cross-examination, scribbled furiously in his notebook, his pen tapping anxiously between lines. They had worked together for months, and though they were not particularly close friends outside of this competition, a mutual respect bound them together now more than ever. Ethan set his briefcase down, adjusted his suit jacket, and opened his binder to review his opening statement one last time. His fingers trembled slightly, not from lack of preparation but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. He had rehearsed every word to perfection. His cadence, tone, and pacing had been refined through dozens of practice rounds. He knew the material. He knew the law. What he could not control, however, was the gnawing sensation in his chest, a mixture of anxiety and something heavier, something physical that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. A subtle throbbing behind his eyes pulsed as he scanned his notes. His vision seemed to swim for a moment before focusing again. He blinked rapidly, willing it away, convincing himself it was just a side effect of too much caffeine and too little sleep. Beside him, Marissa noticed his brief hesitation but said nothing, assuming it was typical pre-performance nerves. The event coordinator entered the room, clipboard in hand, and called out the team's name. Carter, Nguyen, and Patel. You, are on in 10 minutes. The words hung in the air with the weight of a court order. Ethan stood, straightened his tie, and followed his team toward the main chamber. The courtroom was a masterpiece of academic tradition, dark mahogany panels, brass fixtures, and rows of leather chairs filled with an audience of professors, practicing attorneys, and alumni. At the front, a raised bench held the three presiding jurors, each a titan in the legal field. Ethan recognized one immediately, Robert Henderson, senior partner at one of Boston's most powerful law firms and a known stickler for precision in both legal reasoning and courtroom demeanor. His mere presence added a layer of tension that not even the most seasoned law student could ignore. Ethan's eyes scanned the rows of spectators. He caught glimpses of familiar faces, classmates, professors who had once grilled him in cold calls, and even a few recruiters from firms whose logos he had memorized while dreaming of a future far from his modest beginnings. His heartbeat quickened and his hands felt clammy. He wiped them discreetly against the sides of his trousers and took his place at the plaintiff's table. The opposing team sat across the aisle, confident, poised, dressed impeccably. Their lead counsel, Rachel Donnelly, had a reputation for her razor-sharp arguments and an instinctive ability to dismantle opposing viewpoints. Ethan respected her skill, but today she was the obstacle between him and everything he had worked for. The moderator stepped to the podium. "Welcome to the final round of the annual Harvard Law Mock Trial competition," she began, her voice resonant, commanding immediate silence from the packed room. "This year's case involves an international, maritime dispute regarding liability for environmental damages caused by a multinational shipping corporation. Each side will present arguments on contractual obligations, international treaty violations, and jurisdictional authority." As the moderator outlined the rules and time constraints, Ethan felt the walls of the room seemed to press closer. His chest tightened, not metaphorically, but with an alarming physical sensation that made each breath feel slightly more laborious. He rotated his shoulders, trying to loosen the tension, but the discomfort persisted. Still, he refused to acknowledge it. Not now, not here. "All rise," the bailiff called as the jurors entered. The entire courtroom stood. Once the jurors were seated, the bailiff continued. "Plaintiff's counsel may begin with opening statements." This was it. Ethan rose to his feet, buttoned his suit jacket and walked to the lectern. His shoes tapped against the hardwood floor, a metronome to the racing thoughts in his mind. As he placed his hands on the sides of the lectern, the smooth wood felt almost too slick, like his palms had turned to ice. He looked up, hundreds of eyes fixed on him. The jurors stared with the cold, impartial gaze of those trained to detect weakness in argument, error in logic, or faltering in composure. The opposing team watched, prepared to dissect any misstep. Even his own teammates held their breath. Ethan inhaled deeply and began. "May it please the court." The words came out steady, clear, practiced. His voice filled the chamber, carrying the gravity of the legal argument he had spent months crafting. He outlined the key points: the breach of contract by the defendant, the violation of international maritime law, the environmental impact, and the standing of the plaintiffs to bring the suit. But as he moved into the heart of the argument, that nagging tightness in his chest returned with a vengeance. A sudden wave of dizziness blurred the faces in front of him. His hands gripped the edges of the lectern tighter, as if anchoring himself against a tide no one else could see. He blinked rapidly, but the courtroom seemed to pulse, the corners of his vision darkening. Ethan powered through 2 more sentences, forcing clarity into his voice. But with each passing word, the strain grew unbearable. A sharp spike of pain lanced behind his eyes, and his legs felt as if they no longer belonged to him. His mouth opened for the next point, and nothing came. A loud gasp echoed from somewhere in the audience. Ethan staggered backward, his vision collapsing into a tunnel of swirling shadows. His knees buckled, and in an instant that felt both frozen and accelerating, he collapsed onto the courtroom floor. The last thing he registered before the darkness swallowed him whole was the stunned, collective silence of a room that had never, in all its history, witnessed anything like this. The murmurs that filled the courtroom blended into a muffled echo as Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness. For a brief moment, the polished ceiling above him seemed to tilt and warp, its ornate details swirling into patterns that made no sense. Shadows moved around him, blurred figures kneeling, voices rising in sharp concern, and the unmistakable beeping of someone dialing emergency services. But even as his senses struggled to make sense of it all, Ethan's mind refused to surrender completely. He fought against the pull of the darkness with the same stubborn determination that had carried him from his modest beginnings to the halls of Harvard Law. As the world slowly snapped back into focus, his first clear sensation was the cold bite of the hardwood floor against his cheek. His second was the relentless pounding in his chest, as though his heart was determined to punch through his ribcage. A third sensation followed, the collective weight of hundreds of eyes, still fixed on him, balancing between concern and disbelief. "Ethan, can you hear me?" a voice asked. A man crouched by his side, one of the event organizers, his brow creased in worry, a hand lightly gripping Ethan's shoulder. Another figure appeared behind him, a medic summoned from campus security, already pulling a blood pressure cuff from his bag. Ethan nodded weakly, trying to push himself upright. His limbs felt disconnected from his body, heavy and clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. His vision wavered again, but steadied enough for him to recognize the expressions of those closest to him. Marissa stood near the plaintiff's table, her mouth slightly agape, her knuckles white as she gripped her notes. James hovered nearby, frozen between stepping forward to help and holding himself back, unsure whether intervention was appropriate in a setting that suddenly felt more like a hospital ward than a courtroom. The medic's hands moved quickly, but gently, fitting the cuff around Ethan's arm and checking his pulse. "You are severely dehydrated," the medic murmured, reading the numbers that popped up on his device. "Heart rate is way too high. Blood pressure's a mess. You need to go to the clinic, maybe even the ER." "I'm fine," Ethan croaked, his voice rough, unconvincing even to himself. "Fast low blood sugar, maybe." Chicey just stood up too. The medic gave him a look that was equal parts skepticism and frustration, middle of a courtroom argument. "You are not fine." "You fainted in the..." Ethan forced himself into a sitting position, leaning against the leg of a bench. As he tried to process what had just happened, flashes of the past few weeks raced through his mind, and suddenly the warning signs seemed painfully obvious. The persistent headaches that would start mid-morning and grow unbearable by nightfall. The dizziness that struck whenever he stood too quickly. The way his hands would tremble uncontrollably after back-to-back nights of little more than 3 hours of sleep. Even the shallow, ragged breaths he had chalked up to anxiety were now clearly something more, signals his body had been screaming at him to notice. He had ignored them all, every single one, and it was not as though the signs hadn't been noticed by others. His roommate had casually mentioned that he looked like a ghost a few nights ago. Marissa had asked more than once if he was pushing himself too hard. Even his mother, during their last rushed phone call, had said his voice sounded thinner than usual, strained in a way that made her worry despite her constant efforts to sound encouraging. But each time Ethan brushed it off. There was always another brief to write, another case study to finish, another day to survive before he could afford the luxury of rest. "Do you want me to call an ambulance?" the medic asked, pulling out his phone. "No," Ethan said, sharper this time. His head throbbed in protest, but he forced the words out. I can stand." "I behind him." Whispers buzzed through the audience. Some spectators leaned toward each other, exchanging worried glances. Others, less charitable, concealed smirks behind polite hands or muttered criticisms, just low enough to remain out of official earshot. Words like unprepared, reckless, and even weak floated in fragments to Ethan's ears. And yet a different set of voices pierced through, expressions of sympathy, encouragement, even admiration for his determination to stand despite what had just happened. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve and glanced toward the judge's bench. The 3 jurors conferred quietly, their faces blank with professional neutrality, but he caught a quick glance from Robert Henderson, whose sharp eyes held a flicker of something Ethan couldn't quite decipher. Was it disappointment, concern, or ruthless evaluation? A flash of shame burned hot in Ethan's chest, eclipsing even the lingering dizziness. He had spent months preparing for this. This was supposed to be his moment, and now it was unraveling before his eyes, not because of a failed argument or a missed objection, but because his own body had betrayed him. No, that was not entirely true. His body had been warning him for weeks. It was not betrayal. It was neglect. His neglect. The medic handed him a bottle of electrolyte solution, which Ethan accepted with trembling hands. "Sip this slowly. You are severely depleted." As the liquid hit his tongue, its sharp, artificial flavor grounding him slightly, Ethan's mind raced. He could walk out now, accept the suggestion to withdraw, and nobody would blame him. The official narrative would be that a promising student suffered a medical episode. Unfortunate, understandable. People would express regret, offer half-hearted condolences, and in a few weeks, the memory of this collapse would fade into a footnote in someone else's success story. But as he looked down at his open binder, its pages splayed on the floor where it had fallen, something deeper stirred within him, a stubborn, visceral refusal to let this be how his story ended. Not after everything, not after the nights. spent poring over legal precedents until his eyes burned. Not after the years spent climbing out of a life that was never supposed to lead him to these halls. Slowly, shakily, Ethan pushed himself onto one knee, then both feet. The room wobbled around him, but he steadied himself against the edge of the plaintiff's table. The murmurs in the room rose to a hum as the audience registered his movement. Marissa stepped forward instinctively but stopped when Ethan raised one hand, a wordless signal that he was okay. Or at least, that he was determined to be. A stunned silence followed. The jurors exchanged glances. The moderator blinked in disbelief, clearly weighing whether to allow it. Even the opposing counsel, Rachel Donnelly, leaned back slightly, her poised composure briefly cracking as surprise flickered across her face. Ethan took another sip from the bottle, wiped his palms on his trousers, and gathered his papers from the floor. His legs trembled, his head throbbed, but his gaze was steady now. The warning signs had been ignored for too long, but not anymore. Whatever happened next, he would face it standing. The silence that engulfed the room was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. It was not the kind of silence that came with contemplation or respect, but one charged with tension, disbelief, and a strange undercurrent of collective anticipation. Every pair of eyes in that courtroom, from the jurors seated behind the heavy oak bench to the dozens of spectators crowding the gallery, was fixed solely on him. For a moment it felt as if time itself hesitated, holding its breath to see what he would do next. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the lectern, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the faint shuffling of papers and the occasional cough from somewhere deep in the audience. He could feel the tight band of pressure still wrapped around his chest, the residual weakness in his limbs, and the relentless pounding behind his eyes. But more than that, he felt the full weight of expectation, his own, his team's, and perhaps even the unseen expectations of everyone who had ever doubted someone like him could belong in a place like this. He opened his mouth to resume, forcing air into lungs that still resisted the command, but before the words could form, his vision flickered again. The faces in front of him blurred into indistinct shapes, the periphery of his sight dimming like curtains being drawn on either side. His grip tightened instinctively as the world around him tilted violently. For one horrifying second, Ethan was no longer certain if he was standing on solid ground or if the floor itself had given way beneath him. The lectern shifted under his weight, or perhaps it was he who swayed, and with a suddenness that offered no chance for recovery, his knees buckled, a gasp rippled through the room, sharp and collective. Ethan's body hit the floor hard, his shoulder striking first before the rest followed, folding beneath him like a marionette with its strings severed. Several people stood abruptly, chairs scraping against the polished floor. A woman near the back of the gallery let out a startled cry. Papers fluttered from Ethan's hands as he collapsed, scattering across the courtroom like broken fragments of an argument that had barely begun. For a moment, there was only stillness, the stunned, breathless kind that follows an accident you cannot yet comprehend. Then motion exploded all at once. Marissa shoved her chair back with such force it toppled behind her, rushing toward Ethan's fallen form. James followed, his notebook dropping unnoticed to the floor. The moderator stood frozen, mouth slightly open as if caught between protocol and the instinct to act. "Call medical now," someone shouted from the audience. Another voice, clipped and authoritative, barked into a phone. "We need an ambulance at Austin Hall immediately." A student collapsed mid-trial. The jurors conferred in hushed, urgent tones. Even the notoriously stoic Robert Henderson leaned forward, his previously impassive face now furrowed with something that might have been concern, or perhaps a calculating reassessment of the young man whose performance had taken such a catastrophic turn. Ethan's senses flickered like faulty circuits. Voices came in waves, sometimes sharp and clear, other times muffled and distorted as though spoken through water. Hands gripped his shoulders, his back, attempting to turn him gently onto his side. Someone checked his pulse, while another unfastened the top button of his shirt, murmuring reassurances he barely registered. But through the haze, one thing became clear. This was no longer just a competition. Whatever happened now would transcend the bounds of academic rigor and courtroom theatrics. This was real, painfully, embarrassingly real, and every eye bore witness. His breathing was shallow, ragged, every inhale feeling like dragging air through soaked cloth. A sharp, stabbing pain pierced behind his left temple, radiating down his neck. His body felt both too heavy and impossibly hollow, as though some crucial part of him had evaporated, leaving only a fragile shell behind. He heard Marissa's voice close to his ear. "Ethan, stay with me, look at me, okay?" Her tone, normally precise and clipped, trembled now with an edge of fear. "Help is coming. Just stay awake." Ethan blinked sluggishly, trying to focus on her face. Her features swam in and out of clarity, her wide eyes, the tight line of her mouth, the way her fingers gripped his wrist as if by sheer will she could tether him to consciousness. He wanted to respond, to offer some reassurance, but his tongue felt leaden, his throat incapable of forming words. Then came a different voice, deeper, more distant. "Clear the area. Give him space." The medic had arrived, professional, and practiced even in the midst of chaos. Another pair of hands joined Marissa's, replacing hers with more clinical precision, checking vitals, asking rapid-fire questions he could barely comprehend. "Has he eaten today?" "Unsure." "Maybe not." "Any known medical conditions?" "None that we know of." "Possible dehydration, stress collapse?" The words blurred together, technical yet tinged with a very human urgency. Ethan drifted between fragments of awareness, snatches of the courtroom's ornate ceiling, flashes of concerned faces, the metallic clang of someone knocking over a chair, and the unrelenting, suffocating pressure that seemed determined to squeeze every ounce of breath from his lungs. Despite it all now, and despite the embarrassment, the fear, the overwhelming sensory overload, a single absurd thought lodged itself in his mind. This was not how it was supposed to go. This was not the narrative he had written for himself during all those sleepless nights. He had envisioned standing at that lectern, voice strong, arguments flawless, ending with a bow of triumph beneath the approving gaze of jurors and recruiters alike. Not this, not sprawled on the floor, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition unchecked. "Stay with me," Marissa repeated, her hand now pressing something cool and damp against his forehead. Ethan's lips parted. Whether to breathe or to speak, he was not sure. For a moment he thought he managed a word, her name maybe, or simply, "I'm fine," a lie so absurd in that moment it bordered on comedy, but no sound emerged, only a strained, rasping breath. The medic's voice cut through the fog. "We need to transport him, get the stretcher." Footsteps hurried away, then back, the faint squeak of wheels echoing against the chamber's high ceilings. As the stretcher was positioned beside him, Ethan's vision dimmed again, tunneling toward black at the edges. But even as consciousness threatened to slip away completely, something inside him clung stubbornly to the fraying threads of awareness, a desperate refusal to surrender fully. His fingers twitched, finding the smooth edge of one of his fallen note cards. His thumb brushed against the printed text, a line from his opening statement, now cruelly unfinished. "No, not like this. Not like this." As the medic and his team lifted him onto the stretcher, strapping him in with brisk efficiency, Ethan forced his eyes open one last time. He caught the gaze of the lead juror, Henderson, whose expression, unreadable, complex, held his. For a brief electric second, and then without warning everything went dark. The darkness that swallowed Ethan was not absolute. It pulsed, shifting between deep voids of unconsciousness and flashes of fragmented reality that refused to fully form. Distant sounds floated through the fog, hurried footsteps, indistinct voices layered over the persistent hum of fluorescent lights. Somewhere above him, the steady beep of a heart monitor pulsed in rhythm with his own fragile grip on consciousness, an auditory tether that anchored him to the world he fought not to drift away from completely. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, weighed down by exhaustion that seemed to seep into the marrow of his bones. Slowly, with great effort, he pried them open. The harsh, sterile white of the ceiling greeted him first, followed by the blurred outline of a curtain drawn partially around the bed. The smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, sharp, clinical, unmistakable. As his vision cleared, shapes resolved into people. A nurse stood by his side, adjusting the IV drip connected to his arm. Her expression was focused but gentle, the kind of practiced neutrality that spoke of someone accustomed to crises. Beyond her, just at the edge of his sightline, two figures stood in whispered conversation. Their posture, tense, arms folded, heads occasionally tilting toward the closed door, suggested a mixture of concern and something heavier, something unspoken. Ethan shifted slightly, the crinkle of hospital sheets beneath him sounding unnaturally loud. The nurse immediately noticed and turned toward him, offering a small smile. "You're awake," she said softly, as though speaking any louder might shatter the fragile calm. "Just take it slow. You fainted during your trial. You've been out for about 20 minutes. You're at the campus clinic now. Everything is stable." Her words registered slowly, sinking through the layers of confusion and residual fog. Fainted. 20 minutes. Clinic. Stable. Each term felt clinical, detached. Labels for a reality he barely believed could be his. As if summoned by the nurse's acknowledgement, the two figures at the edge of the room stepped closer. Marissa was one of them, her face pale but composed, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed the strain of the past half hour. Beside her was James, his usual sharp, analytical expression softened by something bordering on genuine worry. "Ethan," Marissa started, her voice more brittle than usual, "you scared the hell out of everyone." He tried to respond, but his throat was dry, his voice emerging as little more than a croak. The nurse quickly handed him a cup of water, which he sipped gratefully, the cool liquid both soothing and grounding. "You collapsed. Completely. 1 minute you were delivering your opening, the next, you were on the floor," James added, shaking his head, his tone walking the line between disbelief and something approaching admiration. "It was bad." As he processed their words, Ethan's mind raced ahead to the inevitable consequences. The trial, the competition. His performance shattered in front of the entire faculty, his peers, and, most damning of all, the recruiters and jurors whose evaluations could have opened doors into the legal world he had spent his life trying to access. He struggled to sit up fully, despite the nurse's gentle hand on his shoulder attempting to ease him back. The trial. Am I disqualified? The words felt jagged, too large for the parched space of his throat, but the question pressed harder than any physical discomfort. James snorted under his breath. "Some were already whispering that this was proof you weren't ready, that you cracked under pressure. One guy, Derek from the defense team, he actually said, 'I guess Carter's work ethic finally caught up with him.'" Loud enough for half the room to hear. A bitter knot formed in Ethan's stomach, tightening with each word. Of course, there would be whispers. Of course, there would be those who interpreted this not as a moment of crisis, but as weakness. Exposed. Law school, after all, was a crucible where only the appearance of invulnerability was rewarded. But then Marissa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Not everyone thinks that way. Some people, they were impressed, not by the fall, but by how hard you fought before it happened, and by the fact that even lying there on the floor, you tried to get back up." Her words struck something raw inside him. A flicker of defiance surged, though it was quickly smothered by the reality of his body's betrayal. His hands trembled slightly as he set the cup down on the tray beside him. The door to the room opened, and the event coordinator entered, his face tight with the kind of formal concern that always came laced with institutional obligation. His tailored blazer was slightly rumpled, his tie loosened, as if the morning's order had unraveled alongside the trial proceedings. "Ethan," he began, nodding briefly toward Marissa and James in acknowledgement, before focusing entirely on the figure in the bed. "I wanted to check on you personally. How are you feeling?" "Tired," Ethan admitted, too worn out to offer anything more elaborate. The coordinator nodded. "Understandable. You had a syncopal episode, likely from dehydration, compounded by stress. The clinic cleared you of any serious underlying conditions, but they recommend rest, hydration, and follow-up with a primary care physician." Ethan nodded mutely, waiting for the inevitable transition from concern to consequence. As for the trial, the man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. It's unconventional, to say the least. The panel deliberated during the recess. The defense was divided in their reactions. Some believe the trial should be postponed entirely. Others feel that you stepping away would be the cleanest path forward. But he paused, leveling his gaze at Ethan. You are technically allowed to resume if and only if you feel physically capable. Ethan's breath caught. Resume? He echoed, the word tasting surreal on his tongue. Silence filled the room again, but this time it was a different kind. Not the silence of shock, but the electric, pulsing quiet that precedes a choice with consequences far beyond the present moment. James shifted uncomfortably. Ethan, you do not have to prove anything to anyone. No one sane would expect you to jump back into this after what just happened. Marissa's jaw tightened, her expression unreadable. Got your back. But if you do, if you choose to, Ethan's fingers tightened against the sheet. His body still felt weak, as if even the act of sitting upright was a betrayal of physical limits. Yet somewhere beneath the fatigue, beneath the lingering pain and the humiliation of collapse, was a coil of something harder, something unbreakable. The same relentless drive that had brought him here in the first place. The whispers of doubt, the sidelong glances from classmates, the half-muttered judgments from competitors, they were all real. But so were the quiet murmurs of support, the respect in Marissa's eyes, the raw sincerity in James's voice. The knowledge that this decision right now would define not just his standing in this competition, but the very narrative of who he was, to himself and to everyone watching. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He simply breathed, letting the air fill his lungs slowly, deliberately, as though reacquainting himself with the act of existing fully within his own body. Then, with hands that still trembled, but a voice that emerged sharper than he expected, he answered, "Tell them I am going back in." His steps were not steady. They were careful, deliberate. His body still felt like a fragile vessel, one misstep away from collapse. Yet each step was weighted more with determination than fatigue. He carried no more than his binder, clutched tightly to his chest, the same one that had fallen from his hands when the world went black not long ago. The IV line had been removed, but the tape remained on his skin, a quiet testament to where he had just come from and the sheer absurdity of where he was going now. Inside, the courtroom's energy shifted as his presence registered fully. Heads turned. A whisper moved like a ripple through the gallery seats, some leaning toward one another with barely concealed shock, others simply staring as though trying to reconcile the image of the young man who had collapsed in front of them with the one now walking back toward the plaintiff's table, upright, resolute. Ethan caught a glimpse of the defense team. Rachel Donnelly's composed mask faltered for the briefest of moments, her eyebrows lifting slightly, before she quickly schooled her features back into the neutral professionalism expected of her. But the slight tension in her posture betrayed her surprise. Her team exchanged hurried glances, not quite sure whether to see this as a resurgence of strength or a reckless gamble from someone who had already been pushed beyond his limits. At the judges' bench, the trio of jurors watched with varying degrees of curiosity and caution. Robert Henderson, ever the embodiment of austere scrutiny, leaned back slightly, one hand resting thoughtfully against his chin, eyes sharp and unreadable. His colleagues mirrored his composure, but even they could not entirely hide the subtle shifts in their body language, a straightening of the spine, a narrowing of the gaze, all subtle acknowledgements that something entirely unprecedented was unfolding before them. The moderator stood, adjusting her glasses, clearly caught between protocol and incredulity. Her voice, when it came, was measured but edged with the undeniable tension threading through every corner of the room. "Mr. Carter, are you certain you wish to proceed?" A pause followed, not resistance, but the collective moment required for the weight of his words to settle fully upon everyone present. "Very well," the moderator replied after a moment. Her professionalism slipped briefly into something softer, a flicker of respect perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of the audacity required to return under such circumstances. "Please proceed with your opening statement." Ethan stepped forward. The lectern stood before him like an old adversary, its polished surface gleaming beneath the courtroom's recessed lights. His fingers brushed the edges, remembering too vividly how it had felt to collapse against it not long ago. But now, as his hands settled into place, he felt something else beneath the tremor. Not the false strength of adrenaline, but a kind of stillness, a hard-earned clarity that came only when there was nothing left to lose. He drew in a breath. It was not deep. His chest still protested against the effort, but it was enough. "May it please the court," he began, and this time the words did not tremble. "We stand here today to address not only a violation of international maritime law, but a fundamental breach of responsibility, a breach that endangers ecosystems, economies, and the very fabric of cooperative international conduct." The cadence was different now. Less rehearsed perfection, more raw, deliberate conviction. His earlier preparations, memorized to the point of mechanical precision, now served as scaffolding for something entirely more human. Every sentence carried, not just legal weight, but the subtext of a man who had fought not just academic obstacles, but the limitations of his own body, and won, if only for this moment. As he continued, the courtroom remained frozen in rapt attention. Gone were the background noises of scribbling pens, shuffling papers, or whispered side conversations. Even the defense team's usual strategy of reacting visibly to opposing points was momentarily abandoned. No one wanted to risk missing a single word. Ethan advanced through his key arguments with methodical precision. He outlined the defendants' failure to comply with international shipping regulations, highlighted specific treaty violations, and detailed the environmental damages caused by their negligence. But it was more than just the content. It was the delivery. His voice, though occasionally catching on the strain in his throat, carried the resonance of lived experience, of someone who understood, more than anyone else in that room, what it meant to stand when every fiber of himself demanded otherwise. The physical pain did not vanish. His legs trembled under the weight of standing. His vision blurred at the edges when he turned too quickly between his notes and the jurors. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that he was here. That every word spoken was a small act of defiance against every doubt, both his own and everyone else's. The jurors leaned forward, engaged. Even Henderson, whose reputation for emotional detachment was nearly mythological, tapped a pen against his notebook with a subtle rhythm that suggested focused attention rather than idle dismissal. Ethan noticed it, but did not allow himself the luxury of reaction. Not yet. When he reached the crescendo of his opening, the argument tying the negligence of the shipping corporation to both economic harm and irreparable ecological damage, his voice wavered only once. But instead of diminishing the impact, it heightened it, underscoring the humanity behind the polished legal language. This was not just a case. It was a plea for accountability, framed by law, but delivered by someone who had tasted firsthand what it meant to falter and still choose to fight. As the final words of his statement echoed into the charged stillness, Ethan allowed himself a controlled breath. He stepped back from the lectern, hands falling loosely to his sides. For a moment, he did not dare look at the jurors, the defense team, or even his own teammates. The silence held, not awkward, not expectant, but reverent in a way that even he could not have anticipated. Then the moderator's voice, steady as ever but tinged with something different, was it admiration, broke through. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." He nodded once, returned to his seat, and only then noticed the tightness in Marissa's grip on her legal pad, her knuckles white against the paper. James sat rigidly, his usual cool exterior cracked open by what he had just witnessed. As Ethan settled into his chair, every muscle in his body threatening mutiny, one thing became undeniably clear. Regardless of how the verdict would ultimately fall, something had shifted in that room. A line had been crossed, not by mistake or misstep, but by sheer unrelenting will. And no one, not the jurors, not the audience, not even Ethan himself, would ever forget it. The courtroom seemed to breathe differently as Ethan sat back, down, his pulse still thrumming beneath the skin, but no longer in the frantic, uncontrollable rhythm that had nearly undone him earlier. Now it was steadier, a drumbeat of determination rather than panic. The tremors in his hands had not vanished, nor had the ache spreading across his ribs with every shallow breath, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. The chaos that had threatened to pull him under was no longer steering the wheel. He was. Marissa slid a note across the table toward him. Her handwriting was tighter than usual, sharp strokes betraying her own nerves despite the calm exterior she wore. Like armor. It read, "Strong start, do not push too hard, breathe." He allowed himself the smallest of nods in response, a silent acknowledgement of both her concern and the strategy they still needed to execute. Across the aisle, Rachel Donnelly conferred in a hushed tone with her co-counsel. For the first time, since the trial began, the easy, self-assured confidence that had always seemed to radiate from her had dimmed slightly. Her brow furrowed as she reviewed her notes, recalibrating, trying to decide whether Ethan's return was a desperate display of stubbornness or a genuine resurgence of strength. Either interpretation carried risks for her approach. The judge's bench stirred with movement. Robert Henderson leaned forward, pen poised, his gaze flickering between Ethan and the defense table. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity of his focus could have sliced through steel. The other two jurors mirrored his posture, equally attentive, their hands folded neatly as they prepared for the defense's opening. The moderator called the defense to present. Rachel stood, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with a rhythm that was marginally less confident than before. Her voice was clear, polished, textbook perfect, a model of legal precision. But there was an undercurrent now, a slight tremor at the edges of her sentences that suggested her mind was half occupied with recalculating her strategy on the fly. As she outlined her case, Ethan forced himself to focus, not just to track her arguments, but to recalibrate his own mental footing. The dizziness still hovered at the edges, an unwelcome shadow, but it no longer ruled him. His breathing came, in slow measured pulls, each one anchoring him back to the present moment. This was no longer about whether he could finish the trial. That question had already been answered. This was now about whether he could win it. Marissa passed another. Note, this one shorter but even more vital. Prep for it. Hit it hard. Her third argument is weak. Ethan scanned the defense's flow, watching as Rachel transitioned to an argument about jurisdictional limitations. A notoriously complex angle, but one that Ethan knew was a calculated risk on her part. If the court accepted her framing, it could derail large portions of the plaintiff's case. If they didn't, it would expose a vulnerability she couldn't afford. The cross-examination phase arrived quicker than expected. James handled the first portion, delivering clean, effective questions that forced the defense's secondary witnesses into tight rhetorical corners. His tone was crisp, free from the usual lawyerly flourish, focusing instead on precision. Then, it was Ethan's turn. As he stood, the room seemed to hold its breath again. He moved more carefully now, pacing himself not just physically, but mentally. His steps toward the witness box were deliberate, avoiding the sudden sways that had plagued him earlier. The adrenaline that had nearly broken him before now worked in his favor, sharpening the edges of his thoughts rather than blurring them. "Mr. Donovan," Ethan began, addressing the defense's expert witness on international maritime logistics. His voice was lower than usual, but carried a weight that demanded attention. "You testified that the vessel in question was operating under the flag of convenience, correct?" The witness nodded, shifting slightly in his seat. "Yes, that's correct. And under that flag, you argue that the vessel is subject to the regulatory framework of its home country, not the international environmental standards being discussed here." "That is the standard interpretation, yes." Ethan nodded, slowly as though considering the response carefully. He flipped a page in his binder, the sound crisp in the tense air. "Can you then explain," he continued, stepping forward, "why the vessel's own shipping manifest cites compliance with MARPOL Annex 5, an international environmental treaty that specifically governs the discharge of waste into the ocean, regardless of flag status?" The witness blinked. I'm not sure of the specifics of that document," Ethan pressed. "Regulations? Not sure? Or not prepared to explain how the defendant claims exemption from international law while simultaneously leveraging the protections afforded by the same body of the silence that followed was electric. The witness fumbled for an answer, glancing briefly toward the defense table where Rachel's expression had frozen into a carefully neutral mask. But the crack was visible now. A small fracture, but in the courtroom, a single fault line could become an avalanche if exploited correctly. Ethan did not press the witness to collapse entirely, a rookie mistake that often backfired. Instead, he pivoted smoothly, shifting the focus back to the broader implications of the jurisdictional argument. His questions layered upon one another like scaffolding, each designed to tighten the logical noose until the defense's position became unsustainable. By the time he returned to his seat, his legs were trembling, his throat raw, but the glances exchanged between the defense team told him everything he needed to know. They were rattled, maybe not broken yet, but rattled. Marissa gave him a glance that was equal parts warning and respect. She scribbled on another piece of paper, pushing it toward him without breaking her line of sight from the defense. It read, "Don't burn out now. We need you for the rebuttal." Ethan nodded, resting his hands flat against the table, grounding himself. His breath came uneven, but he caught it, held it, controlled it. The jurors murmured to one another, heads dipping close as they shared notes. Robert Henderson's pen tapped against his notebook again, faster now. His eyes never left Ethan. When the moderator called for a brief recess before closing arguments, the gallery finally exhaled collectively. Spectators leaned back, stretched, whispered furiously among themselves. Reporters from the law school's student publication scribbled notes with a frenzy that suggested tomorrow's headlines were already writing themselves. Ethan remained seated, unmoving. Every muscle demanded rest. Every nerve sang with exhaustion. But as his gaze drifted across the courtroom, from the unsettled defense table to the jury box where decisions were quietly fermenting, he realized something else, something that settled deeper than any physical pain. He was back in control, not perfectly, not entirely. His body might still rebel, might still threaten collapse at the margins, but the narrative of this trial, the flow of its arguments, the tension that dictated which direction the scales of justice might tilt, that was his now. And he was not about to let it go. The moment the recess ended, the courtroom shifted from restless anticipation back to a suffocating silence. Every glance, every shift of paper, every rustle of clothing seemed amplified in the tense air. Ethan could feel it pressing against him, as if the walls themselves were leaning closer, hungry for what came next. His fingers rested on the cool surface of the plaintiff's table, knuckles white, his body a battlefield between the sharp sting of physical limits and the relentless pull of mental focus. The moderator called the session back to order, her voice crisp but tinged with the kind of tension that lingered even after a break intended to relieve it. "We will now proceed with the questioning from the bench before moving to closing arguments," she announced, her gaze sweeping over both sides of the courtroom. "The panel may begin." Ethan had prepared for this. He had known the bench questioning phase would be rigorous. It always was at this level. But what he had not accounted for was the particular sharpness in Robert Henderson's eyes as he straightened in his chair, steepling his fingers. Beneath his chin, something in his posture shifted subtly, a predator's focus narrowing on its prey, not out of malice, but out of a ruthless commitment to testing the very limits of legal precision. "Mr. Carter," Henderson began, his tone deceptively mild, "your argument hinges significantly on the assertion that the defendant's compliance with international treaties overrides the protections afforded by their choice of flag. Are you suggesting that treaty obligations universally supersede national jurisdiction in maritime law?" The question hit with the force of a hammer masked in velvet. It was a legal minefield, designed to expose whether Ethan truly understood the complexities of international law, or if his earlier performance had been little more than well-rehearsed theater. Ethan inhaled slowly. His mind raced, flicking through mental files of case law, treaty structures, and legal commentary. "Your Honor," he began, voice steady though strained, "I am asserting that when a nation voluntarily ratifies an international treaty, particularly one as foundational as MARPOL, It incorporates those obligations into its domestic legal framework, rendering them enforceable irrespective of flag designation in circumstances where cross-jurisdictional harm occurs. Henderson's eyebrow lifted slightly, a small crack in his otherwise impassive mask. "And yet," he countered, "if the defendant's flag state fails to enforce those regulations, do you contend this court has standing to impose penalties based on those same international norms?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the edges of his notes. This was the kind of question that had derailed seasoned attorneys in actual courtrooms, not just mock trials. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the subtle shift of Marissa's body as she leaned forward, ready to leap in if necessary, but knowing full well this was his moment to own or to lose. "Your Honor," he replied, leaning slightly forward despite the pulse hammering in his temple, "the doctrine of universal jurisdiction in environmental law, while limited, does provide standing in instances where transboundary harm is demonstrable, particularly when the harm directly impacts jurisdictions bound by the treaty. Moreover, the principle of due diligence obligates signatory states not only to adopt legislation, but to enforce it in ways that prevent harm beyond their borders." Henderson's pen tapped once against the desk, then stopped. "Interesting," he murmured, though whether it was approval or the calm before a sharper line of questioning was impossible to tell. Before Ethan could exhale, another juror chimed in, this one less imposing in presence but no less meticulous. "Mr. Carter," she said, adjusting her glasses, "your environmental impact argument relies heavily on projected damages rather than demonstrated ones. How do you respond to the defense's assertion that your causality chain is speculative at best?" Ethan swallowed, the dryness in his throat returning like sandpaper dragged over raw nerves. "Your Honor," he answered, "while it is correct that some of the projections involve predictive modeling, these are standard within environmental litigation. The models used are based on internationally accepted methodologies, peer-reviewed, and have been upheld in precedent within the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Moreover, the patterns of waste discharge align directly with the vessel's logged route, providing not merely correlation but causal linkage supported by both expert testimony and documentary evidence." For a moment, the room held still. The juror nodded, scribbling a note, though whether it was in agreement or for further cross-checking was impossible to decipher. But then Henderson leaned back forward, his gaze narrowing. "One final question, Mr. Carter. You appear—" He paused, his gaze flickering briefly, unmistakably, to the residual pallor still evident on Ethan's face. "Determined to proceed despite recent complications. Do you believe that physical endurance is a prerequisite for legal competence, or, conversely, that the inability to maintain composure under pressure should reflect upon one's capacity to practice law?" The question struck with the subtle cruelty of something perfectly wrapped in decorum, yet designed to slice beneath the skin. It was not merely a legal question. It was personal, a test of Ethan's composure as much as his intellect. A hush fell so complete that even the distant hum of the HVAC seemed to pause. Ethan did not glance at Marissa, though he felt her sharp intake of breath. He did not look toward James, though the tension radiating from his teammate was palpable. He looked only at Henderson. "Your Honor," he began, voice lower now but sharpened into something that could cut glass. "I believe that the practice of law demands many things: clarity of thought, precision of language, resilience of mind. Physical endurance, while helpful in the marathon that is this profession, is secondary to the capacity for reasoned argument and ethical commitment. Were it otherwise, we would judge the quality of legal counsel not by the strength of their reasoning but by the steadiness of their pulse. And that," he added, letting the sentence hang deliberately, "would be a grave miscarriage of justice." The silence that followed was absolute. Henderson held his gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then slowly he nodded, the smallest dip of his chin, as if acknowledging not just the answer but the battle it had taken to deliver it. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he said, voice neutral once more. "No further questions at this time." As the questioning phase closed, the air in the courtroom shifted yet again. Something fundamental had been tested, not just the legal arguments, but the person delivering them. And Ethan, battered though he was, had not been found wanting. But the day was far from over. The most critical moment was yet to come. The closing arguments loomed ahead like a final mountain peak, daring him to climb. As the moderator announced the transition to closing arguments, Ethan felt the weight of the entire day crash against, his body like a rising tide. Every fiber of his being trembled under the strain. His muscles ached, his hands were still unsteady, and the dull throb behind his eyes refused to relent. Yet beneath that physical torment was something else, a fire that refused to extinguish, a force of will that had been forged not in the marble halls of Harvard, but in the narrow corridors of his childhood, in the long days and longer nights, that had shaped the person he had become long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. For a moment, as he scanned the courtroom, his vision blurred, not from fatigue but from memory. Faces in the gallery seemed to shift, transform. For a split second, the polished benches faded into the scuffed wooden chairs of his childhood kitchen. The murmurs of law students and jurors blended with echoes from his past, the clang of tools in his father's garage, the scratch of his mother's pen as she balanced bills late at night at the chipped kitchen table. He remembered sitting there as a boy, legs swinging too short to reach the floor, watching his mother frown over a stack of overdue notices, her lips pressed into a thin line. His father, hands stained with grease, walked in, setting a tired hand on her shoulder, offering no words because sometimes there were none that fit. What there was, always, was resilience. A quiet, stubborn refusal to yield to the pressure of a world that never seemed to ease its grip. Those nights had shaped Ethan more than any textbook ever could. The lessons learned in that small, cramped kitchen were not about jurisprudence or precedent, but about perseverance, about what it meant to face down impossible odds without flinching. It was there he first learned that dignity was not granted by circumstance, but claimed in defiance of it. The moderator's voice brought him back sharply to the present. Proceed with closing arguments. Plaintiff's counsel, Ethan stood slowly, carefully. Every movement was deliberate. His legs protested, his head pulsed, but the act of rising itself was a statement now. He stepped toward the lectern, each footfall echoing louder than seemed possible. He placed both hands on the edge of the lectern, gripping it not as a crutch but as an anchor, steadying himself against the storm of expectation swirling through the room. When he began to speak, his voice was softer than before, but carried with it a depth that no amount of practice could manufacture. "May it please the court," he started, letting the words settle before continuing. "This case is, at its heart, about responsibility, about whether those who profit from shared spaces, the oceans, the air, the environment that sustains us all, are bound to the consequences of their choices, whether the distance of a border, the convenience of a flag, or the cleverness of a contract can absolve one party of the harm inflicted upon another." He paused, meeting the eyes of each juror in turn. The defense would have you believe that because the law is complex, because it involves layers of treaties, jurisdictions, and interpretations, it somehow creates a shadow where accountability cannot reach. That is not what the law was built for. The law does not exist to shield those who harm under the guise of technicality. It exists to bridge that shadow, to deliver clarity where ambiguity threatens to reign. As the words flowed, he felt himself slipping into a rhythm that transcended the physical pain anchoring him. Each point built on the next, a crescendo not just of logic, but of lived experience. He spoke of duty, not as an abstract concept, but as something painfully real, of what happens when those in power turn away from the consequences of their actions, of communities left to bear the cost of decisions made in distant boardrooms by faceless corporations whose only allegiance is to profit. And without intending it, or perhaps because it was always inevitable, his voice wove in the echoes of his own life. "I know something about the cost of decisions," he said, letting the words hang heavier than law alone could carry. "About what happens when those with power choose convenience over responsibility. I grew up watching my family wrestle with decisions no one should have to make, whether to pay the heating bill or buy groceries that week, whether to fix the leaking roof or keep the lights on, because someone, somewhere, had made choices that rippled outward, unseen by them but felt deeply by us. A hush fell deeper over the room, the kind that is no longer about the case, but about the truth underneath it. A truth every person in the room recognized, even if their lives had never demanded that particular calculus. When the defendant chose to bypass safety protocols, Ethan continued, his voice sharpening again, when they chose to dump waste into waters governed by international law, they made a decision no less impactful than the ones I just described. The harm doesn't vanish because it occurs out of sight. The ocean does not segregate pollution by borders. Damage does not check a passport before it spreads. He pivoted back to the legal framework with a clarity sharpened by that personal revelation. The precedent is clear. International maritime law does not grant immunity through bureaucratic sleight of hand. The evidence we have provided, the shipping logs, the environmental data, the treaty obligations, all converge on a single undeniable point. The defendant acted with willful disregard for the law and for the communities impacted by their actions. He turned slightly, glancing toward the defense table. Rachel Donnelly's face was impassive, but her hands were clasped too tightly on the table, white-knuckled, betraying the internal battle she fought to maintain composure. Ethan's gaze returned to the jurors. The question before you is not whether harm occurred. The question is whether this court, this institution, built upon the very foundation of justice, will choose to see that harm for what it is. A violation not only of law, but of the trust that binds us all together as participants in a global community. His voice, though raspy, found strength for the final statement. The defendant wants you to believe that complexity excuses negligence, that loopholes excuse harm. But the law, at its best, is not a shield for the powerful. It is a voice for those who suffer quietly and visibly. Today that voice is yours. He closed his binder, stepping back. The silence that followed was total. Even breathing seemed suspended, as though the very air waited to see what would come next. Ethan sat slowly, his body trembling. Marissa placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing briefly. Not in triumph, not yet, but in recognition of the battle fought. James said nothing, only offering the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that words could not capture. Across the room, the defense prepared for their closing, but the energy had shifted. The undercurrent that had once favored the confident cadence of the defense was fractured now, its foundation shaken by something far more potent than simple argument. The past had come into the present, and with it, the undeniable truth that law is not just an intellectual exercise, it is a mirror held up to the world, reflecting who we are and who we choose to be. The defense's closing argument began with the expected poise and precision. Rachel Donnelly rose from her seat, her posture impeccable, her voice measured with the practiced control of someone who had been groomed for this exact stage since childhood. Her words flowed with elegant certainty, weaving through technical defenses, interpretations of maritime law, and jurisdictional nuances designed to chip away at the emotional and legal momentum that Ethan had built. But despite her best efforts, the air in the courtroom was different now. Each time she spoke about technical compliance or jurisdictional limitations, it carried the faint shadow of evasion. The jurors listened intently, taking notes, but the subtle shift in their posture, the way heads tilted slightly, brows furrowed more deeply, signaled that her arguments, while legally sound, were no longer landing with the same definitive, "Wait." Ethan sat still, his hands folded together, fingertips pressed so tightly his knuckles whitened. Every muscle in his body vibrated with exhaustion, but his mind was singularly focused. He absorbed every sentence, every pivot, every rhetorical turn the defense employed. His eyes remained steady, tracking each point, silently constructing the scaffolding for what was about to come. When the defense rested, the moderator called for final rebuttals, the last chance for either side to address unresolved issues, dismantle the opposing arguments, and attempt to seize control of the narrative one final time. Marissa glanced at Ethan, her expression a careful blend of concern and readiness. She had prepared an outline for this moment, They had all discussed strategy, backup plans, contingencies for nearly every outcome, except for the one where Ethan had collapsed mid-argument and then returned. But now, as the moderator turned her gaze toward the plaintiff's table, Ethan raised one hand slightly, stopping Marissa before she could stand. "I've got it," he said, his voice rough but steady. Marissa hesitated, then nodded once, sliding, her notes toward him without a word. Ethan stood. His legs wobbled slightly, but he steadied himself with a palm against the table before moving deliberately toward the lectern. The act of walking felt heavier than it should, each step a conscious effort of will, but it also felt like an ascent, one final climb toward a summit that had once seemed insurmountable. When he spoke, the room shrank down to his voice, the sound of it threading through the silence like a wire pulled taut. "Members of the jury," he began, not with fire but with quiet precision, "the defense has presented a case built entirely on the assumption that complexity equals permission. That if the laws are intricate enough, if the boundaries are blurred just right, accountability becomes negotiable." He paused, letting the words settle. "But complexity does not erase harm. It does not erase the fact that waste was dumped into shared waters. It does not erase the scientific data that traces environmental damage directly to the defendant's operations. And it does not erase the truth that behind every technical defense, there are real consequences felt by real people." Ethan flipped a page in his binder, though he hardly needed it. His next line had lived in his bones long before this trial ever began. "The law," he continued, "was never meant to be a maze designed for the powerful to navigate away from responsibility. It was meant to be a bridge between right and wrong, between harm and remedy." His gaze swept across the courtroom, landing on each juror in turn. "This case is not about loopholes. It is about whether harm occurred, and whether this court has the resolve to recognize that harm and act." His breathing hitched slightly, but he forced himself forward. The pain in his side flared again, a dull spike that traveled up his ribs, but it was distant now, something outside the frame of what mattered. "The defense argues jurisdiction. But let us be clear, the ocean does not respect man-made borders. Pollution does not ask for a passport before it spreads. It flows freely, as do the consequences of negligence." His voice gained strength, a quiet momentum building beneath the words. "They argue complexity because they cannot argue the facts. The facts are simple. Harm was done, obligations were ignored, and this court, this jury, has the power to say, that is unacceptable." He let that hang, the weight of it filling the space between breaths. Then, lowering his voice slightly, he added, "I will not pretend this has been easy. You've all witnessed firsthand what the toll of this fight has looked like. But if nothing else, let that serve as a reminder that standing for what is right, whether in law or in life, demands everything we have. And when the powerful hope you will grow too tired, too overwhelmed, too afraid to hold them accountable, that is exactly when you must hold the line." He closed his binder, not dramatically but with finality. "We ask for a verdict that reflects not just the letter of the law, but its purpose. A verdict that says accountability cannot be outrun by complexity." Ethan stepped back from the lectern. He did not sway this time, he did not falter. He stood, hands at his sides, waiting. The courtroom was absolutely still. No scribbling of pens, no shifting in seats. Even the ever-unflappable Robert Henderson sat motionless, eyes narrowed slightly, chin resting on steepled fingers. The moderator gave a brief nod before turning the floor to the defense, but their rebuttal, though technically sound, had lost its edge. The momentum had shifted, decisively, irrevocably. When both sides rested, the jurors quietly rose, exiting the room, to deliberate. The sound of the heavy door closing behind them felt like a thunderclap. A collective exhale followed, the energy in the room unwinding like a coil that had been pulled too tight for too long. Ethan sank into his chair, closing his eyes briefly. Every nerve screamed. His head pounded with the dull thud of exhaustion cresting beyond anything he had ever known. But beneath the physical collapse was something else entirely. The absolute certainty that he had left everything in that room. Every word, every argument, every ounce of strength. Beside him, Marissa let out a breath she had been holding so long her face had gone pale. "That was, she began, but no word seemed sufficient. James just shook his head slowly, offering a single quiet, "Unreal." Around them, the audience slowly stirred back to life. Conversations began in hushed tones. A few glances were cast in Ethan's direction. Not the pitying looks from earlier, but something sharper, something like respect mingled with disbelief. And now all that remained was the wait for the door to open, the wait for the jurors to return, the wait for the verdict that would determine whether everything, every sacrifice, every word, every moment of suffering had been enough. The minutes dragged by in suffocating silence as the jurors deliberated behind closed doors. Every tick of the clock mounted pressure on those left waiting in the courtroom, each second stretching out longer than the last. People shifted in their seats, whispered quietly, cast sidelong glances toward the jury door as though sheer will might hasten their return. Ethan sat perfectly still, though it was not discipline that kept him motionless, but the sheer reality that his body no longer had anything left to give. Every muscle had tightened into a knot of exhaustion. Every nerve screamed for rest, but none of it mattered now. What mattered was the verdict. Marissa sat to his left, her fingers pressed together tightly, staring straight ahead, but clearly not seeing the room anymore. Her mind was somewhere deep in the labyrinth of everything that had led to this moment. James, to his right, had his arms crossed but tapped one foot relentlessly, betraying nerves that his otherwise calm demeanor tried to mask. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the jury door creaked, open. The entire room tensed. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even the casual scribbling of a reporter in the back row stopped as the jurors filed in, their faces carefully blank, the expressions of those who knew their decisions could tilt the world, at least for the people sitting before them. Ethan straightened, his spine screaming in protest, but he forced his posture upright. He wouldn't meet this moment slouched in defeat no matter what the outcome. He caught a glimpse of Robert Henderson at the judge's bench, still composed, still inscrutable, but there was a subtle shift in the tilt of his head, as if even he acknowledged that this was not an ordinary trial, not an ordinary day. The lead juror, a woman with a calm but firm presence, handed the written decision to the moderator, who scanned it quickly before passing it to the panel. The brief pause as the judges reviewed the document felt like an eternity wrapped inside. Another eternity. The moderator rose. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, carried the weight of finality. "Will the parties please rise?" Ethan pushed himself to his feet, Marissa and James following. Across the aisle, the defense team rose as well. Rachel Donnelly visibly composed, but no longer possessing the unshakable certainty she had at the start of the day. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her lips pressed into a line that betrayed how much she cared about the outcome, even if she would never admit it. The moderator continued. In the matter of Carter versus Atlantic Global Shipping, regarding claims of environmental negligence, jurisdictional violation, and treaty breach. A pause. The room collectively inhaled. "We find in favor of the plaintiff." A ripple went through the gallery. Sharp intakes of breath. A sudden murmur that swelled and then quieted just as quickly. Marissa let out a breath that sounded more like a gasp, clutching the table for support. James exhaled hard, his arms dropping from his chest in shock. But the moderator was not finished. "In addition to finding liability on the counts of negligence and treaty violation," she continued, her voice steady, "the panel also recognizes a procedural flaw identified during closing arguments. Specifically, the defense's reliance on jurisdictional immunity was based on an outdated clause within the International Maritime Framework that has been superseded by recent amendments." The courtroom froze. Ethan blinked. For a second, he wasn't even sure he heard correctly. The moderator pressed on. "This procedural flaw, identified by Mr. Carter during rebuttal, directly impacts the defense's primary line of argument. The panel, after review, concurs that this constitutes a critical oversight. As a result, the defendant is not only liable but subject to penalties enhanced by the governing treaty, for attempts to exploit invalid jurisdictional protections. A gasp surged through the room, this time louder, more sustained. Even the defense table visibly staggered. Rachel's hand shot to her mouth, lowering only when she realized the loss of composure showed. Her co-counsel looked down at his notes as though they might suddenly rearrange themselves into a better answer. Ethan stood perfectly still, not because he intended to, but because his mind hadn't fully caught up with what had just happened. His rebuttal hadn't just succeeded in reinforcing their case. It had revealed a flaw in the defense's foundation that even the judges had not noticed until that moment. He had found a hole in the case law itself, a mistake buried deep within layers of legal complexity that should have been caught by any seasoned attorney but wasn't. Henderson leaned forward at the judge's bench now, no longer hiding his expression. There was unmistakably the barest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Not condescension, not derision, something else entirely, the rare glint of genuine professional respect. The moderator continued, "Given these findings, the panel imposes not only compensatory damages, but also punitive damages consistent with international environmental enforcement statutes. The court is adjourned." The gavel struck. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then chaos, subdued, academic, but chaos nonetheless, exploded. Observers turned to each other in hushed amazement. Reporters scribbled notes frantically, some already typing headlines into their laptops. Law students whispered in disbelief, their voices climbing higher as the realization spread. No one had seen this coming. Marissa gripped Ethan's arm hard, half with shock, half with awe. "Do you even realize what you just did?" Her voice trembled. James, always the more restrained one, just shook his head slowly. "Something people will study. They will teach this." That was Ethan opened his mouth, tried to answer, but found nothing there. His brain was still turning the events over, replaying the last few minutes as though they might reveal themselves to be a dream, an error, a mistake. But no, the courtroom around him was very real, and so was the weight of the decision rendered. He looked toward the judge's bench one last time. Robert Henderson's gaze met his. The older man gave the smallest nod, an unspoken gesture that carried more meaning than any words that could be offered in such a setting. It was not a nod of approval. It was something rarer, a nod of recognition. The silent admission that today, Ethan Carter had stood in this room not merely as a student of the law, but as a practitioner worthy of it. As the defense team packed their papers with movements stiff and mechanical, the gallery remained a storm of disbelief and conversation. People were already speculating how a simple mock trial had transformed into a case study on how the right argument, wielded at the right moment, could overturn not just an opponent, but an entire flawed premise. And Ethan stood at the eye of that storm, knowing that no matter what happened after this day, whether in Harvard, in courtrooms to come, or in the unpredictable turns of life, this moment would never be erased. Even as the gavel's echo faded into the charged silence of the room, the reality of what had happened began to unfold like a tidal wave none of them could outrun. People stood, slowly at first, then in clusters, the low murmur of disbelief swelling into a hum of chaotic energy. The jurors filed out without speaking, their faces still composed but marked with something undeniable, the look of participants who knew they had just taken part in something extraordinary. This was no longer just a courtroom exercise. It had become an event whose ripples would spread far beyond the confines of Harvard Law School. Ethan remained seated longer than most, not because he wished to, but because every muscle in his body screamed in rebellion. His hands trembled, his breathing remained shallow, and the ache deep in his ribs threatened to pull him back toward the edge of collapse. But even beneath that storm of physical exhaustion was a clarity that pushed him forward. The clarity that he had done it. Against every conceivable obstacle, he had not only survived the trial, but triumphed in a way few would ever experience in their entire careers. Marissa sat next to him, still gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Her expression caught between awe and a strange kind of relief so intense it bordered on disbelief. "This wasn't just a win," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile reality of the moment. "This was seismic." James, never one for dramatic language, nodded silently. His gaze remained fixed on the front of the courtroom, where the judges were gathering their notes, speaking quietly among themselves. His foot tapped restlessly beneath the table, but the usual sharpness in his features had softened, replaced with something that looked suspiciously like pride. The defense team gathered their things with mechanical precision. Rachel Donnelly stood stiffly, her jaw tight, her hands folding papers that no longer seemed like the weapons they were when this day began. Her co-counsel avoided eye contact entirely, his focus narrowed to the meticulous gathering of documents, as if by ordering his papers he could reorder the outcome that had just dismantled their case. As the audience filed out, clusters of students began surrounding both teams, but their eyes were fixed primarily on Ethan. Words like unbelievable, legendary, and unprecedented passed between them like sparks jumping from one person to the next. A few whispered to each other while shooting glances at him, already knowing this case would be retold countless times, in classrooms, in study groups, perhaps even in future trial prep seminars. And then, the unexpected happened. The door at the side of the courtroom opened, and two individuals stepped inside. Their presence instantly shifted the energy of the space. Both were impeccably dressed, carrying sleek leather portfolios, and their expressions were those of people who had not come merely to observe, but to act. One was a senior partner from a major law firm based in Boston, his face unmistakable even to those who had never met him in person. The other, a recruiter from one of the most prestigious international firms with offices in New York, London, and Hong Kong. They hadn't been sitting in the gallery earlier. They had arrived during the final phases, alerted by a flood of text, messages from observers in the room, perhaps even by the professors themselves, who recognized something remarkable was unfolding. Their presence now was no coincidence. It was opportunity drawn like a magnet to the epicenter of something exceptional. The partner approached Ethan first, bypassing the crowd entirely. He extended his hand, his expression warm but edged with the professionalism of someone who understood exactly the weight of the moment. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice carrying easily over the chatter, "I have been attending mock trials at this school for nearly 15 years. I have seen every kind of argument, every kind of student performance. What I saw today was not simply impressive, it was rare." Ethan stood, or rather willed himself to stand. His legs threatened to betray him again, but he forced them into cooperation. He shook the man's hand, his own grip weaker than he liked, but steady enough to convey respect. "I appreciate that, sir," Ethan replied, his voice raw but controlled. The recruiter stepped forward immediately after, offering her card before even introducing herself. "If you are not already considering summer placements," she said, "I can assure you there is a place for you at our firm. The kind of clarity, under pressure, the presence, the precision in your argument. Frankly, it's the kind of thing we don't just look for. We fight over." Marissa blinked, half in disbelief. James actually smiled, not his usual polite smirk, but something closer to genuine satisfaction. Ethan accepted the card, glancing down at it as though it might disappear if he blinked too hard. Robert Henderson rose from the judge's bench, stepping down toward the floor. The room quieted instinctively at his movement. Conversations faded, all eyes turned toward him. He approached the plaintiff's table, his hands folded behind his back, his expression a carefully measured mask of professionalism, but the sharpness in his eyes betrayed something more personal. "I will keep this brief," Henderson began, his gaze settling on Ethan but sweeping to include Marissa and James. "What transpired here today was not simply an academic exercise. It was a demonstration of what this profession demands at its best. Clarity of thought, mastery of the law, but more than that, resilience, tenacity, an unwillingness to yield even when the body would prefer otherwise." He paused, his next words chosen carefully. "In my career, I have rarely seen a moment where where an advocate, reshapes the trajectory of an entire proceeding, not through theatrics, but through precision. Today, you did that." A murmur moved through the crowd. Again, the weight of the compliment was not lost on anyone. Coming from Henderson, whose standards were infamous and whose praise was rarer than unanimous Supreme Court decisions, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Henderson nodded. Once more, then added quietly, "Litigation is your future. My firm would be lucky to have you. And for what it's worth, if you ever decide with that," he turned, gathered his papers, and walked toward the exit without another word, leaving behind a silence more profound than any applause could have achieved. Ethan sat heavily, his legs giving out the moment the tension released. His hands shook, whether from exhaustion or the enormity of what had just happened, he wasn't sure. Marissa laughed, half in disbelief, half because it was the only possible reaction left. "Ethan," she said, leaning close, "you realize this. This is going to follow you for the rest of your career. This isn't just something people forget. This is legend." James nodded, tapping the table once with his knuckles, as if sealing the statement. "And deservedly so." Ethan stared down at the 2 business cards in his hands. His vision blurred for a moment, but not from exhaustion this time. Something deeper filled his chest, not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet validation that went all the way back to every moment spent in that cramped kitchen as a child, watching his parents fight battles just as overwhelming, just as exhausting, and learning the most important lesson of all: you do not stop, you do not yield. And when the world tells you that you cannot, you stand anyway. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving behind only scattered papers, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and the lingering presence of something that could not be seen but was, palpably felt, the undeniable imprint of history being made. Ethan sat quietly, staring down at his hands, the corners of 2 business cards peeking out between his fingers, symbols of doors opening that just hours ago had seemed impossibly far. Marissa remained seated beside him, arms crossed, her eyes no longer on the chaotic rush of students leaving, but instead locked on the man beside her, who had defied the limits of both body and circumstance. James sat on the other side, back straight, silent in the way that people become when words fail to carry the weight of what has been witnessed. The moment was too big for celebration, too heavy for laughter, and too profound for casual remarks. They had won. But the word victory felt too simple, too inadequate to encompass what had unfolded. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibration sharp against his thigh. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. A glance revealed a cascade of notifications, texts from classmates, emails from professors, LinkedIn messages from people he had never met but who were already reacting to the wildfire of words spreading across campus and beyond. Screenshots of the trial's pivotal moments circulated like currency. A clip had already been posted, the precise instant when Ethan had identified the fatal flaw in the defense's argument. The caption read only, "Harvard law student finds the glitch in the matrix." He should have felt overwhelmed, but the exhaustion ran so deep it dulled the edges of everything. Yet beneath that exhaustion lived something else, something steady, like the quiet glow of embers refusing to burn out. He had not just survived this day, he had owned it, bent it to his will, redefined what it meant to succeed not through perfection, but through the raw refusal to quit. A knock on the courtroom door startled them. It opened a crack, revealing a familiar face. Professor Elena Sharp, one of the senior faculty at Harvard Law, known for her brutal Socratic method, and her refusal to indulge in anything less than excellence. Her presence here now was unusual. She did not typically attend these trials unless compelled by something truly extraordinary. "Carter," she said, stepping fully inside, her sharp gaze assessing him, not with the cold detachment she usually reserved for students, but with something approximating genuine curiosity. "I assume you are aware of the situation you've created." Ethan attempted a smile, but managed only a breath that might have been a laugh in another life. Starting to get that impression, Professor Sharp walked to the table, setting a folder down with a precise motion. "The Dean has asked me to inform you that the footage from today's trial is being submitted for inclusion in the Harvard Law curriculum permanently. They are preparing a case study around it, not just for future trial advocacy courses, but for lectures on legal ethics, resilience, and courtroom strategy. Marissa's head whipped toward Ethan, her eyes wide. James blinked, leaning back, processing the full meaning of those words. Sharp continued, "Additionally, several faculty members have already recommended you for the upcoming international moot court competition. I doubt I need to explain how rare it is for a first-year student to receive that invitation." Ethan sat back, letting the words wash over him. There was no space left for shock. Only quiet recognition that everything, every hour, every sacrifice, every bruise, every failure, every collapsed breath had led to this. Sharp's tone softened, though her posture remained impeccable. "I also came here for a personal reason." She paused. "I've taught at this institution for over 20 years. I've seen brilliance, I've seen failure, but what I saw today was neither. It was something more dangerous, something more powerful. It was proof that the law doesn't belong exclusively to those born into it, groomed for it, or handed. It belongs to those willing to fight for it, even when it costs them everything." She tapped the folder once. "If you ever consider clerking in the future, you have my recommendation, without reservation." Then, without waiting for a response, she turned and left, the door clicking shut behind her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Marissa broke the silence, voice low but filled with something that sounded like awe. "You have any idea how rare that is?" James nodded slowly. "She doesn't recommend anyone, ever." Ethan leaned forward, pressing his hands to his face, letting them drag down as if wiping away the surreal nature of everything. When he finally looked up, his eyes were clearer than they had been all day. "I think..." His voice caught, but he pushed through it. "I think for the first time it feels like I belong here." Marissa smiled, not the polite kind, but the kind that started in her eyes. "Just belong. You own it." "No, Ethan." "You don't, James," ever precise added, "and everyone knows it now." The rest of the day blurred, waves of congratulations mixed with overwhelming exhaustion. As he stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight, the crisp Boston air hit his face like a baptism. Students nodded at him as he passed, some offering hesitant congratulations, others still processing how the narrative they had written about who Ethan Carter was had been shattered, replaced by something entirely new. By the time he made it back to his apartment, his legs barely carried him. Dropping his briefcase by the door, he stood for a moment, just staring at the space. The small couch he never used, the kitchen table cluttered with textbooks, the tiny bedroom barely big enough for the twin bed it held. And then, slowly, he reached for his phone. There was a voicemail from his mother. Her voice, when it filled the room, was laced with equal parts worry and pride. "Ethan, honey, your classmate's mom called me. She said something. Something happened today. Said the whole school is talking about you. I don't know exactly what, but I know you. I know you gave it everything you had. I just want you to know, no matter what, we're proud of you. Always have been. Always will be." He sat on the floor back against the wall, letting those words soak into the places that still ached from the fight. He had done it. Not perfectly, not without falling. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it had never been about being flawless. Maybe it was about standing, even when standing seemed impossible, and proving that courage speaks louder than failure, louder than doubt, louder than fear. Outside, the city carried on. People walked past, unaware that a battle had been fought and won inside a wood-paneled courtroom tucked within the campus of Harvard Law. But inside one small apartment, a young man sat with his back to the wall, eyes closed, breathing in the realization that life, his life, would never be the same again.